everybody, and welcome to our special spring edition of Tundra Connections. I'm Elisa McCall with Polar Bears International, and we have some great panelists here. Please send them in. We'll be looking for them the entire broadcast. The best way to send us questions is email us at questions@pbears.org, or if you're on Polar Bear TV on the polarbearsinternational.org website, you can put them in the chat window right there. And if you happen to be watching on explore.org, then just put them in the chat window on Explore and we'll get those forwarded to us too. So first we'd like to thank explore.org, of course, for streaming us today and being wonderful partners, and the San Diego Zoo for hosting us at the Panda Conservation Center. And so let's start. Before we even do introductions, can you please explain what the Panda Conservation Center is, Megan?
Sure. The Giant Panda Conservation Center is a great example of what zoos can do in terms of conservation research. We've been here for about 20 years, as long as the Panda Conservation Program has been active at the San Diego Zoo. And this is where all of our researchers are headquartered. Our giant pandas are right outside this window here. Our panda keepers are here, of course, and all of our panda conservation education happens out of here as well. So it's all things panda in one place.
It's been so nice seeing these pandas. I'm used to seeing polar bears, but these are such an amazing bear. To have them right outside is really
Absolutely.
great.
They're an amazing species of bear to study. They're an amazing species of bear to study and contrast with polar bears. And they're also just an amazing sort of conservation ambassador to share with the public, and it's really fascinating to work with them.
Can you please tell the audience a little bit about what you do, your role here?
Sure, I'm a conservation biologist, and my job here at the San Diego Zoo is to manage all of our bear conservation research programs. So my job began here with the Giant Panda program, and it's really unfolded in a way that has really exemplified what zoo-based conservation research can bring. We've been primarily focused on conservation breeding of giant pandas, and now we've expanded that work into field research and field conservation with giant pandas. But we've extended that same sort of idea to all the other bear species, and polar bears, of course, are a big focus of what we do here.
Oh, thank you. Nick, could you please introduce yourself and
Sure.
explain your role here?
Hey everybody, my name is Nick Pofold. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at the zoo, so I work with Megan. My primary study species is the polar bear, so that's what I did my PhD in. But now that I'm here at the zoo, I'm also working on giant pandas, as well as spectacle bears and sloth bears.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
And Tia, can you please introduce yourself and your role with bears?
Yeah. So my name is Tia Beckschrift. I also work with polar bears. And not with pandas.
Not yet.
And I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Alberta in Canada.
That's great. So first, let's set the big picture for these two bears, because they're really on opposite ends of the spectrum in the bear world, but they do have some things in common, and maybe the biggest or most important one for conservationists is that they both are threatened with extinction down the line. And so for both species, we're working to conserve them. Nick, can you maybe talk a little bit about these species, their habitats, where they're living, kind of set this scene for why we're concerned?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to talk about a little bit is their evolution, because these bears are on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the living families of bears that we have now. So pandas are the earliest sort of representation of a bear species, the earliest split from the bear family. They split off about 12 million years ago, so quite a long time ago. Where polar bears, they're much more of a recent species. They only split off from the bear family group about 600,000 years ago, so they're much more of a newer species in terms of the evolution of the bear family group.
Okay, really neat. And so where in the world do they live? So obviously polar bears live in the Arctic, I think everyone knows that. But how does their range compare to that of pandas, and where are pandas really living?
So again, we have two sort of opposite things here. So when we look at polar bears, we think about them living in the north. They have a huge range across what we call the circumpolar Arctic. So what you're looking at right now is a map of polar bear distribution across the Arctic. That area that's covered in white there, that's about 24 million square kilometers. So put that in perspective, that's about 3 times the continental US in size. And in that area, we have about 20 to 25,000 polar bears that live. They're nomadic. They have very large home ranges, up to 500,000 square kilometers. And so we're just taking a bit of a tour around here. They live on the continental shelf on the sea ice. They spend about 95% of their time on that sea ice hunting seals. And they live all the way across through into Russia. Now as we come down, we're going to look at the panda range, and you can see the panda range is much smaller. We're talking about 30,000 square kilometers, so just a fraction of this polar bear range. We have, I think, about 1,800 pandas in the wild right now. That's the most recent number. And they exist in sort of 6 fragmented populations in the mountains in and around China. And they're, as you can see in the video there, they're focused on eating the understory, which is bamboo, in those mountains. And so that's their primary meal, where polar bears, they're focused on seals. So there's quite a few differences between the two species.
Very neat. So they have very different habitat needs.
That's right, yeah.
But we are concerned about both their habitats. Megan, could you maybe explain a little bit about how their habitat concerns are similar in a way?
Sure, I think fundamentally when it comes to conservation, for most animals, it's a threat to giant pandas, as it is for most species. And so that really fragmented habitat that pandas have left is a true remnant of their historic range. And they've been under pressure from human populations for the past couple of hundred years. And so we see that 1,800 animals left, which is absolutely nothing. And so that very, very small amount of habitat is potentially the future for polar bears. And that's what we're really trying to avoid. Polar bears need that large range to make a living, to hunt for seals, and they range over such incredibly vast areas. But if their habitat continues to decline, they will potentially one day have that very limited type of range that giant pandas have, and they really can't survive in healthy population numbers that way.
Right. Both these species are so specialized compared to, say, the black or brown bears. They
Right.
really have specific habitats and diets
Right.
that they need. Oh, that's really interesting. So one question we get a lot, at least with polar bears, and I can only assume with pandas, is can't these bears simply adapt to the changing environment?
Well, they can't. So the changing environment is changing so fast. And we have to remember that the specialized adaptations that all the bear species have, all animals have evolved over millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years at the very least. And habitat is being transformed in a time scale of decades. And so it's not enough time to evolve to take advantage of other food sources. And bears, as a family, tend to be very much generalists. So if you put a piece of meat in front of a giant panda, it'll probably eat that piece of meat, but it's not evolved to survive off a diet of meat. And so in the wild, they need thousands and thousands of acres of bamboo to live their life on. And as that area shrinks, they don't have what they need.
Wow. And the reason we talk about, to explain kind of the mechanism behind why it's changing so fast, largely it's driven by human causes. So our atmosphere on the Earth is kind of like this nice warm blanket that keeps us warm. All these gases are trapped
Here, because the polar bears really are just superbly adapted to the environment that they live in. But one of the things that I love, and I hope that most of you have also seen a picture of it, is the foot of a polar bear. Mm-hmm. So the foot pads of a polar bear. Obviously they're walking on ice and on snow. So they have these little anti-slip, what do you call them?
Suction cups.
Yeah, suction cups on the pads on the bottom of their feet so that they don't slip on the ice. Also, their claws are always extended, but they are so that they're not actually walking on their claws, because that would be a little bit like walking on ice in high heels, and that would not be easy for the bears. And then also the fact that they actually have quite hairy feet, which also of course helps keeping them warm, and also for traction. It's really good. So I think that's pretty awesome.
So polar bear feet are pretty cool, and panda feet are pretty cool too. They
Yeah.
have, you're telling me about a thumb that they have. Or
Yeah,
something
absolutely.
else.
So bear feet are fascinating. I love bear feet. And giant pandas have a really unique adaptation. So as we've talked about, giant pandas eat bamboo, and they don't just sit down in a pile of bamboo and put their head in it and chew away. They actually are very particular in the way they manage the bamboo that they eat, and they do a range of very specific things to that bamboo to process it to eat. And so they handle it a lot. And so their front paw actually has an extension of their wrist bone. And what that wrist bone does is it serves as sort of a thumb. We actually call it a pseudo thumb, which means a fake thumb. And they use that to hold the bamboo, and it really enhances the efficiency of what they're doing. And so it seems like bare feet are really a great sort of reservoir of unique adaptations for how they eke out a living.
That's really neat. So with the panda eating bamboo, what is their skull like for that sort of chewing, or their teeth?
So giant pandas actually have the biggest, strongest bite and skull of any of the bears, so even stronger than a polar bear. And they have their molars, the teeth in the back, are actually quite flat. And that, like animals that make a living off of grasses, like horses and cows, they have very flat teeth. And so unlike the rest of the bears in the bear family, a giant panda has flat molars. And that helps them grind the leaves and get all the nutrients they can out of it, because it's a very, very low energy food source, low nutritional food source.
Right. And so that's very different from a polar bear skull.
Yeah,
and
totally.
maybe, you could explain a few things about the more carnivorous bear.
Yeah, right. So we got an example of a polar bear skull here. And the differences are quite striking compared to a panda. So if we look in the back here, Megan was just talking about how the pandas have a very flat molar set because they're grinding vegetation down. And if you can see here, polar bears have very sharp molars. And what that's all about is tearing at the flesh. They're going after seals, and they need to pierce the skin through with their back teeth to get into the fat that they want. The other difference you would see between a polar bear skull and a panda skull is polar bears have this really long gap between their molars and their canines, what we call diastema. And what that allows for is the canine to sink really deeply into the seal. So as humans, we all eat our food, hopefully with knives and forks, but polar bears, they get in their face first. And seals are really slippery prey to catch. So you really want to get in with those big canines and dig in deep to hold on to that prey. So what you're looking at here is a polar bear stalking up on a seal, and you can see those seals, they're slippery prey, they're big prey, they're hard to hold on to. One of the other adaptations for polar bears in their skulls is just the size of their canines. So the canines here are quite extended and long, and again, that's about sinking their teeth into that prey source. The shape of the head is a little bit different too. So what Megan was saying about bite force, polar bears don't actually need a really large bite force because seals have a very weak skull. So what they'll do is they'll bite at the back of the neck and they'll break that skull pretty easily on a seal. So they don't actually need a very strong bite force. What they do need is a head shape that allows them to get down round breathing holes. So seals will make breathing holes in the ice that are round and circular in size. And if you have a square blocky head like a panda or like a grizzly, you're not going to fit your head down that seal hole. You know, it's a square peg round hole problem, right? So polar bears have a much more slender cone-shaped head that allows them to get into those tight spots and get after seals. The cool thing about pandas though is we got a bit of bamboo here to show you. And we're just going to illustrate here pandas' bite force. So pandas can actually eviscerate this fairly easily. Just stick that between their back molars and bite down and crunch on it and get to the nutrition that they need on the inside. This is hard wood. I mean, there's no way that I'd ever want to stick that in my mouth and try to bite down. But pandas do it with ease, and that sort of shows you the differences in their adaptations for their skulls, for sure.
Wow. So obviously very different diets. One question that we get asked a lot about polar bears is about their digestive system, or maybe what their poop looks like. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about polar bear digestion, maybe like a little bit about their poops. And we also have a question about wondering how much fat can polar bears store at any time?
Right, okay. So polar bears are really good at, well, first of all, polar bears eat seals. And what they mostly eat is actually seal blubber. So they eat the fatty part of the seals, and that has a big effect on what comes out in the other end of the polar bear.
Yeah.
Because if you, like a polar bear, eat very fatty, then what comes out at the other end is going to be very oily and very runny, for lack of a better word. So if you're out on the sea ice and you find polar bear poop, it's likely this long brown black slick, kind of looks like oil. Mm-hmm. But if you then go on land, some of the bears are on land during the summer when there's no sea ice, and they will eat berries, they'll eat kelp along the shore, and that makes the poop look very different. So it looks a little bit more like grizzly bear poop. So it's more in a pile, and you can see all the leftovers of the berries and the kelp, so there's a lot more fiber in it. And it has a slightly different color also, a little bit lighter brown.
Right.
But the brilliant thing about polar bears also with the fatty diet that they have is that they are really well adapted to it. Now, humans, if we eat a diet that is as fatty as the bears, we would probably get heart problems pretty quickly. But the bears their physiology is just really well adapted to this, and they have this special bile, so they're really good at breaking down the fat in their blood vessels and actually putting it on the sides, packing it on as it should be, instead of causing heart problems.
Right. And they can store a ton of fat at a time, hundreds of pounds they gain very quickly of fat.
Really, really rapid weight gain.
Wow.
If there's a lot of seals around, they will eat until they cannot move fast enough to catch the next seal.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And very different. Megan, yesterday you told me a little bit about panda poop, and I was surprised. And maybe you could tell the audience a bit about what that's like.
It's sort of another way that giant pandas are at the exact opposite end of the bear family from polar bears. So giant pandas, they live off bamboo. There's absolutely minimal fat in bamboo. It's a very, very low energy food source, so giant pandas eat constantly. And here at the San Diego Zoo, giant pandas will eat up to 50 pounds of bamboo a day. And we also supplement that bamboo with other things as well. But bamboo is their mainstay. And so if you can imagine sitting down and eating this incredibly leafy, fibrous food all day long, you're going to be pooping a lot too. And giant pandas actually will poop about 50 pounds a day. 50 times a day, excuse me. It might be 50 pounds. And they eat all the time and they poop very, very frequently. And it's a very, very different consistency than what a polar bear's would be. It actually looks like large goose poop. So it's very fibrous. It comes out in a very well sort of shaped way. And you can tell by that there's been very little digestion happening in the course of that process. So there's really low digestibility with the bamboo. And the nice thing is, for scientists in the field, scientists love poop because we can learn a lot about animals through that. And so for giant pandas, much of what we know about giant pandas in the wild, how many pandas there are and what they eat, is by studying their poop. So they leave a great trail of their existence in the wild that way.
Very interesting. So with these two different food sources and these two different areas and these two very different species, one can only assume that the way that these bears get around is maybe a lot different. So Nick, first I was wondering if you could talk a bit about swimming.
Sure, yeah. So polar bears are very much at home in the water. They're not as aquatic as, say, a seal, but they have to deal with open water a lot. So especially when that sea ice starts to break up in spring, open water exists between flows and they'll have to swim from flow to flow. So what we see with polar bears is they're really adept at swimming. They're very strong. They have strong front forearms that'll paddle for them. They'll kind of leave their legs out in the back almost like rudders to steer, and they'll just power forward through the water. And in some cases, we've seen bears do very long distance swims continuously. So they have the ability to go for long periods of time without stopping. I think the record is adult female who swam 687 kilometers straight for 9 days straight, not stopping. And so that's a really incredible ability to deal with open water and swim, and something that is completely different from the rest of the bear family.
Right. So polar bears are really good swimmers, maybe not the most amazing climbers because they don't need to really ever climb trees, but pandas are good climbers.
So pandas are good climbers, and actually in the wild, young pandas will spend quite a bit of time in trees. And here at the zoo, we also find that as well. So we make sure that in the enclosures here, they have ample places to climb and get above because they like to do that. But they're not the most arboreal of bear species either. And we do find that adults, they might like to be on top of a rock, but they don't spend a lot of time climbing. They have more capacity than polar bears, but they don't climb a heck of a lot.
Oh, interesting. So you mentioned the young cubs like climbing. Maybe we can veer off and touch on reproduction. So bear reproduction in and of itself is an amazing topic that we could spend hours on. But maybe we'll just touch on a few things. So some of the similarities between polar bears and pandas is that they have a short gestation period.
Yeah. Giant pandas and polar bears, they have this very, very short true gestation period. And I say true gestation because there's actually this period of time that's very flexible in the pregnancy of a bear. We call it delayed implantation. And what that means is that after the bears breed, there'll be some period of time where the conceptus doesn't start developing. So gestation hasn't started. For giant pandas, we know that gestation is about 50 days. That's not even 2 months. For polar bears, we assume it's similar to what a brown bear would be, which should be about 2 months. But that's nothing. So we think about human gestation, it's 9 months. And after 9 months of gestation, we know human babies are completely helpless. They absolutely depend on their mom for all of their needs. And bear cubs are the same way, and even more so because of that shorter gestation time.
Interesting. So when bear cubs, when they're born, they're very, very tiny. Tia, maybe, can you tell us how big a polar bear is?
It's about a handful.
It's just handful
it's
of
about
polar
a
bear,
half a kilo,
Okay.
500 grams. So yeah.
And they grow pretty quickly, though.
And they're also, if you look at the bears in the zoos, you usually see that they, you can see the black skin on the nose and around the eyes. And if you're lucky, you can see it under the feet. But actually, when the cubs are born, they're all pink. They're pink and they have this very fine, fussy hair.
Oh, neat.
So.
And polar bears and pandas, I see, make really good moms. Maybe you could touch briefly on maternal care in both species, Tia and Megan.
Sure. Polar bears and pandas share, because their cubs are so helpless, maternal care skills are incredibly important across the bear family. And, in some ways we know very little about what it takes to be a good polar bear mom. And that's an area that we're really trying to learn more about. Because that time in the den with the mom is so critical, we know that the mom really needs to make sure that the cub is fed, that the cub is able to go to the bathroom. Basically, when the cubs are born, they're so completely helpless and so undeveloped, for lack of a better word, that the mom actually has to help with the process of going poo and peeing. And those are really important biological processes. And the same is true for giant pandas. And we know from our work here at the zoo and at other zoos, we've been able to put cameras inside the dens of giant pandas and watch maternal care in great detail. And that's really helped us understand what it takes to be a good bear mom. And it's a lot of work. It looks exhausting.
Another little internet glitch there.
Yeah.
A couple of months between the time you're born until you have to start walking behind your mom across hundreds of miles of frozen sea ice. You want to be as developmentally mature and with as much fat on your body as possible. So that time in the den is extremely important in order to take advantage of mother's protection once you get out of the den.
So a lot of this, moms have to be intelligent. Bears have to be intelligent. They're very intelligent species, all of them. But sometimes we get questions about, who's smarter, a polar bear or a panda? But they're both smart in their own ways.
Absolutely.
And some of that has to do with foraging ability. And maybe, Nick, you could talk a little bit about hunting versus foraging for these bears and the thought process that goes into that.
Well, I don't know if I can really get into the thought process,
fair
but hunting and foraging are two totally different things.
Right.
When you're thinking about hunting, you're thinking about moving after a mobile prey, so something that doesn't want to be eaten, right? So you have to chase down, you have to figure out solutions to sneak up on that prey and be able to capture it and kill it. And especially in the polar bear world, this is a complex problem because sea ice is always moving, it's dynamic, seals are in and out of the water, it's a three-dimensional problem because seals can go under the ice flows. So polar bears have come up with a lot of different strategies, and that aids in their intelligence in terms of the type of curiosity and sort of ability they have to seek out new environments and novel situations. I think with pandas, it's a different situation in terms of how they forage because their prey doesn't move. It just grows. But they have other challenges in their environment too, which is the fact that there's seasonal cycles in the bamboo. So they've had to learn to figure out which places to go in which seasons to take advantage of bamboo growth cycles so that their main food source doesn't disappear behind them. So there's a different type of intelligence there in terms of their movement behavior and their strategy. And certainly, when you look at a panda, getting after a big chunk of bamboo, it's not the easiest thing to break into, even with those powerful jaws. So they have to come up with solutions. That pseudo thumb that they have helps, but they're almost, in some ways, very.
One second, sorry.
That's okay. I gotta wrap it up.
Babbling.
Sorry. What? Oh,
It's still out.
yeah, we'll try getting through the rest of this in about 10 and taking a couple questions and then wrapping up. We still have, I'll ask about
The puzzle bugs.
the puzzle. That was next. Yeah.
Sounds
good.
Yeah, perfect. Right.
Okay, yeah, so just wrapping up on bamboo, it can be a tough source of food to work with. And so there's intelligence that's gathered there about what's the best way to break into this food and get what you need out of it. So yeah, different strategies for different types of food.
Right. And Tia, I heard you kind of talk about the polar bear world, or something like a puzzle. Or something
Yeah,
like that.
there's a group of researchers in the U.S. or here in the U.S. that they designed this puzzle box. So basically, just this box, and it had a slightly complicated opening system. And then they gave this box to a number of different carnivores, and the bears were, of course, part of that study. And actually, the bears were the most successful in managing to open that box and get the food that was in there. So we're not just claiming that they're smart, we also have actual data.
Right, it's not just because we like them.
They're really intelligent, they're really curious, and even though you may not think it when you look at the paws, they're dexterous. Dexterous. Yes.
And so this intelligence will hopefully help them, in a changing environment. It can only help them so much, but navigating this environmental instability.
I think that intelligence helps an individual navigate day-to-day challenges, but it won't help the species overcome those large-scale challenges. It's very different things. So we do see evidence all the time, though, of their intelligence, as Taya was talking about.
So we've had a couple similar questions come in about the role of zoos in conservation. And so one thing I wanted to highlight before maybe we go bigger picture is the hearing studies that you've done, Megan, with these bears, because the zoo bears have taught us so much about wild bears.
Absolutely. I mean, whether you're talking about a giant panda or a polar bear, studying bears in the wild is really challenging. As I mentioned before, with giant pandas, much of what we know about them in the wild is from studying their poop. So directly studying wild bears is a huge challenge. Here at a zoo or a conservation breeding facility or a rescue facility, we have opportunities to study animals non-invasively, up close and personal. And so when it comes to certain aspects of their biology, it really helps to be able to study them every day or to have them participate in research every single day. And so one of the ways we took advantage of that was when we were concerned about what polar bears could hear. And we were concerned about that because in certain parts of their habitat, they can be exposed to some very loud, large-scale industrial activity, which has a tremendous amount of noise associated with it. And so we thought one of the ways we'd like to understand the impacts there is to ask what they could hear. And so the best way to learn what any animal can hear is to do basically what happens when you get your hearing tested in a doctor's office. You play a tone for your patient, and they tell you whether they heard it or not. So we took that same idea and we used it with polar bears. And so I think that it really demonstrates not only their intelligence in terms of them being able to show us that they heard something, and also their ability to understand that every day when they get into a certain place in their enclosure, that this is going to be what happens. And so we were able to do this with polar bears, and then we were able to take that same type of study and use it with giant pandas. And we used food reward, so if a polar bear responded correctly when they heard something, they got a treat. And we used a little bit of meat for the polar bears. And when we were working with giant pandas, we would use a little bit of bamboo or something that they would find also tasty. But it really was a great way to learn something about both species in this type of setting, and we could never have done that in the wild.
That's really interesting. Maybe before we move on to the next topic, we just got a really great question about bamboo. And instead of paraphrasing, I'm going to read the entire thing because it's really well thought out and have you answer. Okay. So the question is, I'm curious about how panda bears choose the kinds of bamboo they eat. Are there varieties that are more or less nutrient dense? Has anyone considered looking into genetically modified varieties of bamboo that would provide better nutrition? And how does the zoo source enough bamboo to feed these bears?
That is a one-packed question.
Right, that's great, yeah.
But it's a great question.
Yeah.
So as far as the genetically modified component, I don't think anybody's working on that, but it's a really great point, and it's something that would be interesting to think about more, because bamboo does take up a tremendous amount of land cover to grow enough bamboo for bears that are in conservation breeding centers like this. Bamboos in the wild will move seasonally to take advantage of certain dynamics in the bamboo cycling. So here at the San Diego Zoo, we don't have the same species that they would eat in the wild. Mm-hmm. So we have similar species of bamboo, and we find that our bears are incredibly picky, and each of them has their own specific species of bamboo that they prefer, and we try to make sure that they have what they want.
That's really interesting. So let's maybe zoom out a little bit to conservation concerns for both species. And maybe Nick, you could talk a little bit about human encroachment into habitat and maybe a bit of bear-human conflict for both species.
Yeah, absolutely. So these species face similar concerns. As Megan talked about earlier, with the pandas, it's mostly been a historic concern. Pandas only occupy about 1% of the historic range, and that was because for the last 3,000 years there's been a huge human footprint in China with agriculture, and pandas have been basically forced out, and even direct poaching. So pandas had faced challenges from human interactions now, and now it's a much better situation. They're protected, but they're down to only about 1,800. So we see what has happened from this historic sort of human interaction. With polar bears, the concern is as that sea ice melts where they prefer to be, they're forced onto land more often. And when they're forced onto land more often, they get into conflict issues with humans. And the reason is if...
Sorry.
Okay, so what I was saying was polar bears, as the sea ice melts, they're forced onto land more frequently and for longer periods, and they're forced away from their primary prey. So what we're concerned about is that that's going to make them come into communities where they're attracted to food resources, maybe landfills, things like that, and they'll get into problems and human conflict that way. And that can be an issue because you can actually have direct mortality from that. You can have bears that end up being destroyed because of human conflict, and we don't want to see that. We want to see that be mitigated. So essentially, it's the two species give us sort of a contrasting sort of image. You know, we see one where we've seen historic sort of persecution, and now we're seeing stability and hopefully rebounding populations, and one where we're seeing so much rapid change. And what we can predict in the future is that there might lead to more human-wildlife conflict and persecution for polar bears, which we don't want to see.
So another more maybe indirect human effect on bears is pollution. And Tia, that's one of your specialties with polar bears. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how pollution impacts polar bears.
So when we see where polar bears are living, we don't really think about pollution because it's nice and white and it looks so clean. But unfortunately, all the chemicals that we're using in our everyday lives are transported into the high Arctic with the wind and with the ocean currents. And so they're incorporated in the food web, and the polar bear, unfortunately, is right on the top of that. And they get everything concentrated, and that's what they eat. And all these chemicals, or a lot of them at least, we know, they mimic the body's own hormones. And obviously this then disrupts the entire hormonal system, so it has effects on reproduction and on metabolism, and probably also on cognition, so on learning abilities and memory.
Wow.
We can't say for sure yet, but this is what our studies are indicating.
Really interesting. So besides just the direct conflict, the pollution, of course we can circle back to the climate change issue, which is impacting all the bear species, well, most species on Earth really in some way, and it's a way that ties them together. Now one way, sometimes it can be hard to explain to people the impacts of climate change, or especially for pandas and polar bears. You know, most of North Americans don't get to see pandas and polar bears every day, and while they might really like them, you know, they might not feel a personal connection. And that's one way that zoos can maybe really play a big role, is allowing people to feel this personal connection. with these ambassador animals almost.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, anybody who comes to the zoo, if you stop 10 people, you might find 10 different reasons for them being here. And the nice thing too is that, we have these incredible animals here that we get to share with the public, both, when they come to visit the zoo or in our online presence. We have an opportunity to talk with them, and the animals get to inspire them. And so when people come here, they don't necessarily walk in as conservationists, but they will certainly walk out knowing more about animals, knowing more about what they need, knowing more about how a person's individual behavior might impact the survival of that species in the wild, and most importantly, inspired to want to know more and to do more. And understanding just truly how very small changes in one's daily behavior can actually have a big impact down the road.
And maybe each panelist can give an example of a behavior or something that we can all do to help polar bears and pandas?
Sure. I ride my bike. so one of the things I try to do to combat climate change is live close to where I work and ride my bike back and forth, because until we have serious improvement in automobile transportation, it's one of the big producers of greenhouse gases, and that's causing a lot of issues on our planet. So I try to avoid that as much as possible by getting on my bike.
Nice.
I think Nick's example is one of the best examples, and I try to talk to kids about that all the time, because actually for children the best thing that they can do to help polar bears and giant pandas is get outside and play. So to close your laptop, take your earbuds out, get outside, run around, and use your body and enjoy the outdoors, and not be inside as much and using electronics, and making sure also that your parents are turning off lights and being energy wise.
Great.
Well, for me, I'd say recycling, reusing and recycling, and thinking about the products that you buy, not just in regard to climate change, but also in regards to pollution. Because there are always several options, and at least one of them will be the friendlier choice. Okay.
That's a really good point. And some things that we try to talk about, each one of these solutions is wonderful, and we are really trying to push the community level solutions for each one of these. So if there's, for example, a bike community or bike lanes or community groups, join that. Community recycling programs, play groups, things like that. The more we can all do together is really, really great. And for any adults out there, you can kind of get involved at the legislative level. So Earth Day's tomorrow, and Polar Bears International has a petition on our website that's urging people to sign to encourage the leaders to keep moving forward. The Paris Agreement will be signed tomorrow by world leaders. It's very exciting. Anything you can do to tell the people in charge that this really matters to you. They want to stay in charge, and so they want the support of the people, and they want to be doing what the people want. And if it's really loud and clear that we want renewable energy and fewer fossil fuels, then we can move in that direction. So that's really great. So maybe we'll just take a couple more questions that came in, and then we'll have to wrap it up. One question was, how do we know how many bears there are in each species, and male and female breakdown?
Oh.
I'll
take the polar bear.
Sure.
So for polar bears, it's a tricky question, because they live over such a huge area in a very tough place to get and do research. So for the populations that we know a lot about, what we try to do is go out on a regular basis and count bears, and also do what we call mark recapture, which is identify individuals and then see if they've come back the year after. And from that, we can understand how they're surviving. But if you look at the map that's on the screen right now, there's 19 subpopulations. Almost half of those, we don't actually have a good estimate for the population. So we're doing our best, but it's expensive work to do, and it's very challenging work because of the environmental conditions.
So it is quite a bit easier to count giant pandas than it is to count polar bears. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the primary ways in which biologists have done a census of giant pandas is through counting the number of panda sign that they find in panda habitat, and that sign is feces or panda poop. And we have ways to control for an individual that is leaving, a number of different sign in their environment. But that is our primary way of counting giant pandas. And again, I'd like, just to emphasize that another reason why it's easier to count giant pandas than polar bears is that there are so few of them left in the wild. And we really don't want it to be easy to count polar bears. We want to continue to make estimates that are in the tens of thousands for polar bears. And we look at giant pandas and we frequently call it a conservation success story because over the past 20 years, we think the giant panda population in the wild has gone from about 1,200 animals to about 1,800 animals. That's a huge improvement. We're moving in the right direction, but it's still very, very few animals.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. I think we will have to wrap up, but thank you everyone for joining us today. Just all these community solutions. If you're interested in helping polar bears and pandas, you can check out the polarbearsinternational.org website, or I'm sure the San Diego Zoo website.
Yes.
Take a look at that.
Absolutely.
Really thank you for being here. Thank you for having us. Thank you to the San Diego Zoo. This has been really great. Thank you to explore.org. Check out that petition online if you are interested in signing it, and also remember that tomorrow is Earth Day, so whatever you can do, get out there. There's lots of stuff going on tomorrow for Earth Day. It's all really, really exciting. And we will hop into the chat window right after this and try to answer the last few questions coming in. And yeah, just thanks again. This was really great. And thank you to the panelists. This was a lot of fun. I've had a really great time learning more about pandas. Yeah, they've been really fun. So thanks everyone from San Diego, and maybe we'll see you next time. Well, who knows? Maybe in Churchill, maybe sooner. We'll keep you updated. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.